The most dangerous financial advice you have ever received, the one whispered by well-meaning parents and shouted by anxious headlines, is that the path to wealth is paved with deprivation. You have been told that if you simply stop drinking your morning latte, if you clip enough coupons, if you turn the thermostat down until you can see your breath in your living room, you will eventually find yourself standing on the shores of financial freedom. But I am here to tell you that this is a lie. In fact, aggressive, fearful saving is often the fastest way to guarantee you will stay poor. This is not a call to be reckless. It is not an invitation to squander your paycheck on fleeting luxuries. It is a fundamental shift in the physics of your own life. It is the realization that you cannot shrink your way to greatness. You cannot starve your way to abundance. The paradox of the modern economy is that the man who clutches his coins the tightest is often the one who loses them the fastest, not to thieves, but to the silent, invisible erosion of inflation and the rust of missed opportunities. To understand this, we must look away from the spreadsheets and look into the life of a man named Elias, a man who built a fortress of savings that eventually became his prison. Elias Thorne lived in a small, gray town in the Pacific Northwest, a place where the rain seemed to fall sideways and the moss grew thick on the north side of everything. Elias was a good man. He was a responsible man. He worked as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a shipping company, a job that required him to account for every crate, every mile, and every gallon of fuel. He was good at it because it suited his nature. Elias was the architect of his own anxiety. He viewed the world not as a playground of opportunity, but as a minefield of potential disasters. His entire financial strategy was built on a foundation of defense. He didn't play to win. He played not to lose. If you walked into Elias's apartment, you would see the physical manifestation of his philosophy. The furniture was covered in plastic to preserve its resale value, though he never intended to sell it. The lights were always dimmed to the lowest setting. In his kitchen, a whiteboard tracked every single cent spent, down to the penny. If the price of eggs went up by 10 cents, Elias didn't think about how to earn more. He thought about how to eat less. He believed he was being prudent. He believed he was safe. But Elias was committing the first and most fatal mistake that keeps people from true wealth. He was hoarding a depreciating asset while neglecting the appreciation of his own life. He was treating money like a finite resource to be trapped in a jar, rather than a current that needs to flow to generate power. The tragedy of Elias was that he felt he was doing everything right. He had a savings account that he affectionately called the bunker. It held 6 months of living expenses, then 12 months, then 2 years. But the number in the bank account was a liar. While the balance grew slightly, the cost of the world around him grew faster. His rent increased. The price of gas climbed. The dollar he saved in 2015 could only buy 70 cents worth of goods in 2023. Elias was running on a treadmill, sweating and exhausting himself, checking his pedometer and celebrating the distance, all while remaining in the exact same spot. He lived in a state of chronic, low-grade contraction. He said no to dinner with friends because it was unnecessary spending. He said no to a professional certification course because the tuition was too steep. He said no to fixing the strange rattle in his car engine because he was waiting for a better time. He was building a wall against the world, brick by penny-pinched brick. But the problem with walls is that while they keep the enemy out, they also block the sunlight. And without sunlight, nothing grows. The collapse of Elias's strategy didn't happen with a bang, but with a series of whimpers that eventually became a scream. It began on a Tuesday in November. The rattle in his car engine, the one he had ignored to save $300 in mechanic fees, finally snapped. The timing belt gave way on the highway, destroying the engine block. The tow truck, the emergency repairs, and the rental car wiped out 4 months of his meticulous savings in a single afternoon. 2 days later, a pipe burst in his apartment complex. While his landlord covered the structural damage, Elias's personal belongings, his cheap, uninsured furniture, and his collection of vintage books were ruined. He hadn't bought renter's insurance because he viewed the $20 a month as a waste. He sat on the edge of his bed that night, the smell of damp carpet filling his nose, looking at his banking app. The numbers were decimated. Years of saying no, years of eating cold sandwiches, years of wearing threadbare coats, all gone in a week of bad luck. He felt betrayed. He had followed the rules. He had sacrificed. Why was he back at zero? The despair that washed over him was heavy and cold. It wasn't just about the money. It was the realization that his safety was an illusion. He had spent his life preparing for a rainy day, but when the storm actually came, his umbrella was made of paper. It was in this state of raw vulnerability that Elias met Julian. Julian was not a financial advisor. He was a man who owned a local nursery and landscaping business, a man whose hands were always stained with soil and whose face was etched with the deep lines of someone who laughed often. Elias met him while waiting for the bus, his car still in the shop. Julian was sketching a garden design in a leather-bound notebook. They struck up a conversation about the rain, which led to a conversation about the flood in Elias's apartment, which eventually bled into Elias's bitter recounting of his financial misfortune. Elias expected sympathy. He expected Julian to nod and agree that the world was unfair and that prices were too high. Instead, Julian looked at him with a piercing, curious gaze and asked a question that stopped Elias cold. "You spent 10 years building a dam," Julian said, his voice gravelly and warm. "But did you ever think about digging a canal?" Elias blinked, confused. Julian tapped his notebook. "You treat money like water in a desert," he continued. "You think the goal is to trap it, to keep it in a tank. But water that sits still goes stagnant. It breeds mosquitoes. It evokes fear because every drop you drink is one drop less in the tank. That is the architecture of poverty, son. True security isn't a tank, it's a river. You don't hoard the water, you direct it. You let it flow out to water the fields, so the fields grow crops, which you sell to bring in more water. You stop the flow. You try to save yourself into safety, but you only starved your future." This was the moment the window of revelation cracked open. Elias argued, of course. He talked about discipline. He talked about the virtue of thrift. Julian listened, then shook his head. "Thrift is keeping the weeds out of the garden," Julian corrected. "What you have is not thrift. It is fear dressed up as virtue. You are afraid to plant a seed because you are terrified of losing the seed. But if you never plant the seed, you are guaranteed to starve. You are mistake number 2. You value the currency more than the value the currency can create." Over the next few weeks, as Elias took the bus with Julian, he began to observe the older man's life. Julian didn't live extravagantly, but he lived abundantly. When Julian's delivery truck needed tires, he bought the best ones on the market, not the cheapest. "I buy them once," Julian explained, "so I don't have to think about that. Worry costs you energy. That energy could be used to make money." This was a revelation. Elias realized he had been paying a poverty tax his whole life, buying cheap boots that leaked, eating cheap food that made him sluggish, using cheap tools that broke. He was leaking time and energy to save pennies. The shift in Elias's mindset was not immediate. It was a slow, painful grinding of gears. The old neural pathways of fear were deep, but the image of the stagnant tank versus the flowing river haunted him. He realized that his third great mistake was waiting for perfect conditions. He had always told himself he would invest, start a side business, or learn a new skill once he had enough of a cushion. But the cushion was a mirage. The perfect time never arrived because his fear always moved the goalposts. The rebellion of small steps began on a Saturday morning. Elias was walking past a closing down office supply store. He saw a high-end, ergonomic office chair being sold for pennies on the dollar. His old instinct screamed at him, "Walk away. Save the $50. Put it in the bunker." But he remembered Julian's voice. "Plant the seed." Elias knew that his back hurt every day from his cheap desk setup, making him tired and irritable by 3 p.m. That fatigue made him sloppy at work. He bought the chair. It was a small, almost ridiculous act of defiance. But sitting in that chair the next week, he felt different. He had energy in the evenings. Instead of collapsing on the couch, he opened his laptop. He began to look at his own industry, logistics, with fresh eyes. He saw the inefficiencies. He saw how small local businesses struggled to manage their supply chains because they couldn't afford the big software systems his company used. Elias decided to commit what his old self would have called heresy. He took $1,000 from his replenished emergency fund, money that was sacred, and he didn't put it in a high-yield savings account. He didn't buy a stock. He bought a subscription to a data analytics tool and paid for a weekend seminar on small business supply chain management. He felt physically ill when he clicked purchase. His stomach churned. The voice of his parents, the voice of society, screamed that he was being irresponsible. He was spending his safety net on thin air. But this was the fourth mistake he was unlearning. The belief that education and tools are expenses, when in reality, they are the only true assets. He was moving from a defensive posture to an offensive one. For 3 months, nothing happened. He studied. He tinkered. He felt the fear gnawing at him. But then, he approached a local bakery that was famous for its sourdough but notorious for its chaotic delivery schedule. He offered to overhaul their delivery route for free, just to test his theory. If he saved them money, they would pay him a percentage of the savings the following month. The owner, skeptical but desperate, agreed. Elias applied his new knowledge. He didn't just work harder, he worked differently. He used the software he had purchased. He restructured their routes. In the first month, he cut their fuel costs by 20% and reduced late deliveries to 0. The bakery owner was ecstatic and wrote him a check for $500. It wasn't a fortune. It was less than what Elias used to save by eating ramen for a month. But when he held that check, something in his soul shifted. This money felt different. It wasn't money he had kept by hiding. It was money he had created by solving a problem. He had planted a seed, and the earth had responded. This is the point in the story where the magic of scaling begins, but also where the psychological battle intensifies. The old Elias would have taken that $500 and desperately thrown it back into the bunker to replace what he had lost. But the new Elias, the one who was learning to be a gardener of wealth, did something else. He reinvested it. He printed business cards. He took a local coffee shop owner out to lunch, not the cheapest lunch, but a good one, to discuss their logistics. He was rectifying the 5th mistake, isolation. He had spent years thinking he could save his way to success alone, in a vacuum. He realized now that money is a byproduct of human connection and value exchange. You cannot get rich in a hermetically sealed room. As the months turned into a year, Elias's life began to expand. He didn't quit his day job immediately, but the dynamic had changed. He no longer walked into the office terrified of being laid off. He knew he had the ability to generate value elsewhere. This confidence changed his posture. It changed the way he spoke in meetings. Ironically, this lack of desperation made him more valuable to his employer, who eventually offered him a promotion. The old Elias would have taken the raise and hidden it. The new Elias used the raise to outsource his cleaning and laundry, buying back 5 hours a week to focus on his growing consulting side hustle. He was no longer trading time for money. He was trading value for money, and then using money to buy time. This is the holy trinity of the wealthy mindset. Let us pause here and look at the philosophy that Elias was now embodying, the philosophy that separates the anxious saver from the wealthy creator. He had learned that true safety does not come from a number in a bank account. A number is static. It can be erased by hyperinflation, by a market crash, by a lawsuit. True safety comes from the capacity to produce. If you strip a wealthy person of all their cash but leave them their skills, their network, and their mindset, they will be wealthy again within a year. If you give a fearful saver $1 million but leave them with their poverty mindset, they will be poor again within a decade, paralyzed by the fear of losing it. Elias learned that the first mistake was believing that risk is the enemy. Risk is not the enemy, stagnation is. The ship in the harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. And eventually, the barnacles will rot the hull anyway. He learned that the second mistake was misunderstanding the definition of expense. Buying a suit for an interview is not an expense. It is an investment in perception. Buying a gym membership is not a luxury. It is an investment in longevity and energy. The only true waste is spending money on things that numb you. Mindless entertainment, status symbols to impress people you don't like, or temporary comforts to soothe the pain of a life you hate. By the time Elias's side business matched his salary, he was a different man. He wasn't driving a Ferrari. In fact, he still drove a modest car, but it was well-maintained and reliable. He didn't live in a mansion, but his home was filled with light, good books, and sturdy furniture. He no longer clipped coupons, not because he was arrogant, but because his time was now worth $50 an hour, and spending 20 minutes to save 50 cents was a bad business decision. He walked past the bank where he used to go to compulsively check his balance. He realized he hadn't looked at the bunker in weeks. He didn't need to. He had built something better than a bunker. He had built an engine. He had stopped building walls to keep the world out and had started building bridges to let the world in. The transformation of Elias Thorne is not a fairy tale. It is a blueprint. If you hold your breath forever, you die. You must exhale the money into investments, into yourself, into your business, so you can inhale a larger breath next time. The second mistake is price versus cost. You focus on the price tag of a book, a course, or a quality tool, ignoring the cost of not having it. Ignorance is the most expensive thing you will ever own. The third mistake is linear thinking in an exponential world. You think if you work hard for 40 years, you will be safe. But the world is changing too fast. You must take the small risks now to learn how to adapt. The fourth mistake is solitude. You try to fix your finances in secret, ashamed and isolated. But wealth is a team sport. It requires mentors, partners, and clients. And the fifth, and perhaps the deepest mistake, is believing that you are unworthy of abundance. You punish yourself with deprivation because you do not believe you are capable of creation. Elias stood on the balcony of a small office space he had rented for his firm. The rain was falling, the same gray rain that had once depressed him. But now, he saw it differently. He saw the water flowing into the gutters, rushing down to the river, feeding the trees, turning the turbines of the hydroelectric dam. The water was moving, the world was moving, and he was finally moving with it. So, I speak to you now, not as an observer, but as a witness to your potential. Look at your own life. Where are you building walls? Where are you saying no to your own growth out of fear? Where are you pinching pennies while dollars fly over your head? It is time to stop playing the victim of the economy. It is time to pick up the hammer, not to build a bunker, but to build a loom, a forge, a ship. The path to wealth is not a straight line of deprivation. It is a spiral of education, investment, and connection. It requires the courage to be temporarily poorer in cash so you can be permanently richer in assets. It requires the audacity to trust yourself more than you trust a savings account. Do not let the fear of the storm keep you from planting the harvest. The storm will come regardless. The question is, when it passes, will you be hiding in a hole with your last can of beans, or will you be standing in a field that you planted, ready to reap what you have sown? The choice is not in your bank balance. It is in your mind. Stop building walls. Start planting seeds. This is the only way to be truly free.